In our last journey through the Appalachian region, we wandered into the places where folklore and fear intertwine. We spoke of circles scorched into the earth, restless spirits who whispered their names in the dark, and creatures said to move in the shadows of the mountains. Appalachia has always been a place where the land itself feels alive, watching from the tree line, echoing through the caves beneath your feet. But the strangest truth of all is this. Sometimes it isn't the wilderness that harbors the darkest secrets. It's the walls that we build ourselves. For centuries, humans have carved their way into these mountains, and what they built still lingers as scars on the land. In this chapter of Tales from Appalachia, we leave the forests and descend into two of the region's most infamous monuments of human suffering: Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky and the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia. These weren't just buildings, they were worlds unto themselves. They were meant to heal, but instead they became prisons of isolation, despair, and death. The sick and the broken were sent through their doors with promises of recovery, but for many, they were nothing more than waiting rooms before the grave. The stories that cling to their crumbling hallways aren't just about history, they're about what remains. Footsteps echo where no one walks. Whispers follow you from room to room. Shadows stretch unnaturally long across decaying floors, and some claim that the souls who suffered there never left, bound to the brick and mortar by pain too heavy to release. So if the forests of Appalachia reminded us that the earth holds mysteries of its own, then the asylums remind us of something far more unsettling. Sometimes the most haunted places are the ones we created with our own hands. Tonight, we step into their halls, and once you enter, you may not come back the same. This is Tales from Appalachia Part 2, where we will see that not all monsters hide in the woods. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Harloween. And as you saw from the intro, from the title, this is Tales from Appalachia Part 2. I was so happy to see how many of you loved Tales from Appalachia Part 1. In fact, I was surprised because it's always been a huge personal interest of mine, something I've been kind of, obsessed with, hyper fixated on. And I always worry when I put out videos like this because I know it strays from my normal true crime content. And I love it, and I love putting them together and researching them and delivering them to you, but I'm worried that people won't like them. So to see the warm reception, how much everybody was really into it, it gave me a lot of joy beyond belief. I want you to know that, and I want you to understand how much I appreciate that and how much I appreciate you guys for keeping an open mind and trusting me to tell you these stories even when they stray off the beaten path of what we usually talk about. And it seems I'm not the only one who's endlessly fascinated by this mysterious and beautiful region. There's just something about Appalachia, something ancient, haunting, and yet deeply human. It keeps drawing us back. I'm so glad you all felt that too, and I hope you'll enjoy Part 2 just as much as we keep exploring the stories, legends, and strange energy that make this place unlike anywhere else. But before we dive into today's episode, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Midas Merge. Okay, Harloween fan, do you ever feel like something ancient is lingering just under the surface of this world, like the leaves are whispering secrets from long ago? Well, in today's case, those whispers are coming straight from the haunted gardens of gold. Welcome to Midas Merge, a magical merge 3 puzzle game where the fate of a forgotten realm hangs in the balance, and it's up to you to bring back the light. You'll team up with King Midas and Queen Laia to push back the darkness cast by Nyx, the goddess of night. And Nyx, she's dark, stylish, mysterious, like full villain era energy. And every time I make a new merge, I feel like I'm getting closer to unraveling her story. But here's the twist. The land is shrouded in shadow. Creatures have vanished. The gardens are withering. And the only way to lift the curse? Merging enchanted relics, sunbursts, and creatures to revive the realm. And the creatures, let me tell you, I'm obsessed. They are so cute, it's criminal. There's one called the Cappy Bird. It starts off as this little fluffy baby bird. And by the third merge, it's evolved into this majestic, glowy forest guardian. You'll want to protect them all. Think cottagecore cryptids, and you're halfway there. But this is Halloween. Or it's Harloween, and we love cute, but we also love spooky. So I am excited to tell you that Midas Merge just launched the Haunted Gardens. From now until November 3rd, you can explore this spooky, cute Halloween realm filled with deadly plants, trapped souls, eerie tombstones, and adorable haunted creatures, like genuinely adorable. And here's my favorite part. It's completely free to download. It's ad-free. You can even play offline, which comes in clutch when you're on an airplane or in an airport, or really anywhere where you don't want to trust the public Wi-Fi. It's perfect for when you're traveling in a waiting room or just hiding under a blanket, ignoring the world. Not that I've ever done that, today at least. And this part is just for you. The first 200 people who download using my link or a QR code will get the exclusive Spellbound Fox, only available during the Haunted Gardens event. It's spooky, powerful, and has my name on it. You don't want to miss it. Seriously, I can't stop playing. There's always another cute creature to discover, and each one brings me deeper into the mystery. Join me in the world of Midas Merge. You can scan the QR code or check the description box, and don't forget to light your garden before Nyx takes over. Thank you so much to Midas Merge for sponsoring today's video, and now let's dive into Harloween. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was born out of 19th century America's uneasy relationship with mental health. That's putting it mildly. Construction on the asylum began in 1858 in Weston, West Virginia, on land that was then still rugged, wild, and far from the centers of modern civilization. Weston itself was, and still is, a small, quiet Appalachian town, but in the mid-1800s, the area surrounding the asylum was isolated, bordered by dense forests, rolling hills, and a river that cut like a vein through the landscape. To settlers, it was a place of opportunity, but also of unease. Locals whispered that the land seemed heavy, that echoes carried too far at night, and that the asylum, with its massive Gothic Revival stone walls and endless corridors, seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress against something unseen. The asylum project followed the Kirkbride Plan, an architectural philosophy championed by Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, who believed that sunlight, fresh air, and sprawling rural settings could cure the mentally ill. This was meant to be a place of healing, not punishment. The asylum itself is staggering in scale. At its peak, it's sprawled across 666 acres. Yes, that number. With a main building so large, it remains the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America and second largest in the world, behind only the Kremlin. Its looming towers and endless windows stare blankly across the West Virginia hills like watchful eyes. Even before the horrors that unfolded inside, there was something uncanny about the place. Local farmers and travelers said the air around the building felt colder, that the surrounding woods seemed to hush as you approached. By night, when moonlight hit the limestone walls, the asylum looked less like a hospital and more like a cathedral for the damned. But there was an irony built into its foundations. Construction paused during the Civil War when control of the site and the surrounding area became a matter of bloody contention. Confederate and Union soldiers both fought in Weston, and at one point, Union troops seized $27,000 of gold intended for the asylum's construction to help fund the war effort. Though no major battle was fought in Weston itself, skirmishes occurred nearby, and many soldiers died of illness and wounds in temporary camps around the asylum. People have claimed to hear phantom cannon fire and the distant cries of the wounded. At night, when the asylum is quiet, visitors have reported the sound of groaning men and clashing steel, like a battlefield replaying itself underground. Locals and visitors have long reported hearing the stomping of boots and the clatter of rifles echoing through the asylum's corridors. Guides say that shadows resembling men in Union uniforms have been seen marching down the long central hall, always in a straight line, as if still on duty. Some accounts describe the sound of drums and bugles faintly playing in the distance, fading in and out like a ghostly parade. One specific legend speaks of a gray man seen wandering the asylum grounds, believed to be the spirit of a Confederate soldier who deserted and was executed on site by Union troops. Witnesses describe him as a tall figure in a ragged uniform pacing the perimeter walls as if he's still trying to escape. By the time the asylum opened in the early 1860s, its legacy was already marked by conflict and blood. However, while countless towns around the country were left financially crippled by the Civil War and many struggled in poverty for years to come, Weston avoided that fate. Thanks to the asylum, the town sidestepped post-war depression altogether. Businesses thrived as the massive institution became the heartbeat of the local economy, sustaining Weston for more than a century until its eventual and needed closure 130 years later. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, asylums weren't actually just for the mentally ill. Anyone considered socially undesirable could end up there. The elderly, epileptics, orphans, alcoholics, and sometimes even wives deemed unruly. Families often had no resources or understanding of mental illness, and institutionalization was seen as the only option. The stigma of keeping a mentally ill relative at home also drove admissions upward. Weston and towns like it often relied on asylums financially. More patients meant more state funding, so institutions like this were often encouraged to admit more people than they could handle. Trans-Allegheny, like many other asylums, became a dumping ground for society's perceived problems, and overcrowding happened almost immediately. Now, remember, I said that the asylum was built in the Kirkbride style, which was developed by Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, a Pennsylvania psychiatrist who believed mental illness wasn't just medical, it was environmental. So it's not just something going on in your body or your brain, not just an illness. Your surroundings are affecting your mental state, which in a lot of cases, is true, right? Depression and anxiety can be caused by your environment and your surroundings, but sometimes it is also chemical imbalances and other things. So Kirkbride felt that patients needed fresh air, sunlight, exercise, and visual beauty to recover. And so many Kirkbride asylums were intentionally massive and ornate, with the intention to inspire hope and dignity for both the patients and the surrounding community, kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So these asylums were designed in a long central structure with staggering wings on either side, a layout which allowed maximum sunlight and air to enter each room, and the grounds featured all sorts of things: gardens, farms, workshops, and recreation areas, so the patients didn't feel necessarily that they were imprisoned, even though they were. But what began as sunlit, orderly, and therapeutic spaces would devolve into dark, crumbling warehouses of human suffering. Initially intended to house no more than 250 patients, which matched Kirkbride's philosophy of humane care, overcrowding is not humane, the Trans-Allegheny Asylum would eventually hold over 2,400 people. And there's a lot of reasons for this. This is largely due to the rise of industrialization and urban poverty. In the mid to late 1800s, the United States rapidly shifted from an agrarian society, planting and farming, to one fueled by factories, mills, and coal mines. And when that happened, cities began to grow at an unprecedented pace, drawing thousands of workers from rural areas and from abroad. But these cities were not ready for that kind of population influx, which led to overcrowded tenements, poor sanitation, dangerous working conditions, rampant disease, and of course, widespread poverty. Urban poverty meant that many families couldn't care for members who suffered with mental illness. In farming communities, someone who was considered a little off would still be able to contribute to chores or be cared for by extended family, but in a city surrounded by strangers who were all trying to make ends meet, surrounded by strangers who, were trying to take care of themselves and they didn't really care about you or your family, these people now were far more of a burden and far more vulnerable. With little to no social or financial safety net, asylums became the solution, a place to put people that society didn't know how to handle or didn't want to handle. On top of that, dangerous factory and mining work produced high rates of injury and disability. Imagine a young man in the late 19th century, like 23 years old, working in one of West Virginia's booming factories. His job is repetitive, exhausting, dangerous, hauling heavy machinery parts on an assembly line. One afternoon, a gear slips loose and strikes him hard on the side of the head. He collapses unconscious, and when he comes to, he's never quite the same. Over the next weeks, his family notice a dramatic change. He grows irritable, forgetful, and prone to violent outbursts. His once steady hands now tremble when he tries to hold tools, and his speech sometimes falters mid-sentence. Today, with our medical science and technology, we'd likely recognize this as a traumatic brain injury causing, neurological and behavioral symptoms. But in the 1880s, these changes were seen not as medical, but as madness. So his wife, unable to cope with the violent mood swings and fearful for their children, she petitions the local authorities. The doctors, lacking modern understanding of brain trauma, classify him as insane. Within a month, he's committed to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and there he joins hundreds of others, miners crushed in collapses, railroad workers injured in accidents, and mill hands broken by years of strain, all suffering from neurological or psychological conditions that society couldn't explain. The overcrowding destroyed the original vision of the Kirkbride plan. Instead of airy rooms with privacy, patients were crammed 8 to a room or lined up in hallways. Obviously, sanitation would be much harder to keep up with, leading to vermin infestations. Rats and mice carried parasites like fleas, transmitting illnesses to the already vulnerable patients. Lice and bedbugs thrived in cramped, unwashed bedding and spread infections. And then there was the rampant malnutrition, which most likely was not intentionally cruel at first, but a result of too many people and not enough food. Food supplies were stretched thin, and patients often received bland, minimal meals with little to no nutritional value. They might get a chunk of stale or moldy bread, some watery broth, maybe a tiny hunk of meat if it was available, but fresh fruits and vegetables were served rarely, if ever. These factors created a deadly feedback loop. Malnourished patients couldn't fight infections, while the infections spread faster in cramped, unsanitary wards. Doctors of the time often misinterpreted this physical decline as part of the patient's madness rather than a symptom of neglect and sanitary issues. Staff were overworked, underpaid, and woefully unprepared for the sheer magnitude of need that these patients would have. It was insane. Like, they were not trained at all to handle these psychological conditions that these patients were suffering from. So the staff, the nurses, the orderlies, well, they became exhausted, and exhaustion hardened into bitterness. Resentment festered. Some attendants turned cruel, while others simply gave up, leaving patients to fight amongst themselves. The asylum became a powder keg. Violence was constant. Survival was brutal, an everyday fight. And when things became too chaotic, doctors turned to measures that weren't treatments at all, but tools of silence and control. And here's where things get very disturbing. And we're going to start with one that I think we're all very familiar with, but maybe don't know or understand exactly how bad it was and how far it went. And I'm talking about the lobotomy. Lobotomies, once heralded as a miracle cure, became a routine way to silence the disobedient, the violent, or honestly, simply the inconvenient. In a place where hope had drowned beneath the noise, blood, and hunger, the asylum descended into something less like a hospital and more like a human warehouse. I want to introduce you to a man who I think, genuinely, because I believe in evil spirits and demonic presences, I feel that Dr. Freeman was less of a man and more of a sort of sociopathic demon on Earth. I think he was put here intentionally to bring pain and trauma and horror to people. So Dr. Walter Freeman was a neurologist, not a surgeon, and he became obsessed with the idea of finding a cure for severe mental illness at a time when psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded. He believed mental illness could be solved not through therapy or medication or kindness, but by physically altering the brain. Now, he wasn't the one who invented the lobotomy. That was Portuguese neurologist Antonio Igues Moniz, who in 1935 pioneered leucotomy by drilling into the skull to sever white matter in the frontal lobes. However, Dr. Freeman saw that idea as revolutionary and sought to bring it to America. So he teamed up with neurosurgeon James Watts and in 1936 performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States at George Washington University Hospital. Freeman later refined the procedure into something even quicker and more brutal, the transorbital lobotomy, known as the icepick lobotomy. So instead of opening the skull, Dr. Freeman slid a sharp instrument, which was at first an actual ice pick, and later a surgical tool that he called the orbitoclast. So he slid this sharp instrument, an ice pick, under the eyelid and through the thin bone behind the eye socket. We are going to talk about this in more detail in a minute, but at times, Dr. Freeman performed the operation using little more than local anesthesia and sometimes even in front of live audiences, making it a spectacle. And get this, he traveled the country in his van, grimly nicknamed the Lobotomobile, performing thousands of procedures at state asylums like Trans-Allegheny, where patient numbers far exceeded capacity. His willingness to do mass operations meant patients didn't have to be carefully screened, right? Basically, the institution could call him up and be like, hey, we got some rowdy patients over here. Why don't you come on over and lobotomize them? Some of these patients were institutionalized adults with schizophrenia or depression, but others were children, teenagers, or simply people deemed difficult or non-conforming. So Freeman performed lobotomies on people as young as 12 years old. Dr. Freeman is estimated to have performed around 3,500 lobotomies in his career. And no surprise to anybody, many patients died on the table from hemorrhaging or seizures. I mean, there's an ice pick going into their brain. Now, others did survive, but were left with devastating side effects like seizures, paralysis, incontinence, or reduced cognitive function. Some were left in a near vegetative state, unable to care for themselves. Now, this is not to say that the normal, average lobotomy was not also dangerous, because it was. And that normal first sort of version of the lobotomy caused multiple issues and left many, if not most patients, also incapacitated. And years before Dr. Walter Freeman came up with the transorbital lobotomy, he was already performing standard lobotomies. And one of his most infamous cases was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, whose failed lobotomy left her permanently incapacitated. Now, this is a really sad story that I didn't know everything about before doing my research for this video. But now that I do know more about it, I'm absolutely shocked and disgusted. Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13th, 1918, the oldest daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. It is said that from the time she was a baby, Rosemary's development lagged behind her brothers. She crawled, walked, and spoke later than expected. At first, her slower progress wasn't really an issue for her family, but when her younger siblings began outpacing her, the Kennedys recognized something was different about Rosemary. With their limited understanding of developmental and intellectual disabilities, or mental health in general, the family kept Rosemary at home under the belief that they could provide better care than any institution. And of course, they had the freedom and the finances to do so. But as Rosemary grew, so did her struggles. She was sort of a wild card. That's the best way I can explain it. She may have had some developmental sort of issues there. She behaved, even into her late teens, like an unruly child. Very little impulse control, very oppositional and aggressive. And despite attending private schools, including a Montessori convent school in London, she increasingly felt isolated among her peers and her high-achieving siblings. And there were stories of her at this school in London where she was kind of always acting out, getting into fights, not really able to make friends. She was always trying to escape, crawling out her window at night, things like that. So she was asked to leave. And after returning to the States, Rosemary's behavior became more concerning. She was exhibiting erratic mood swings, convulsions, and she began flying into violent rages, kind of getting aggressive with people, including her family members, and she was sneaking out at night a lot. And this greatly concerned her parents, especially her father, who arranged for his own daughter, Rosemary, to undergo a lobotomy in November of 1941 when she was just 23 years old. The doctors had told the Kennedys that this procedure would help calm Rosemary's mood swings and outbursts, but the most infuriating part of this is that Joseph Kennedy Sr. was told by Dr. James Watts and Dr. Walter Freeman that Rosemary simply had a form of depression. There was nothing else wrong with her. She wasn't psychotic. She didn't have schizophrenia. She was just kind of sad and acting out, not knowing what to do with that sadness. And Dr. Watts would later describe what they had done to Rosemary in vivid and disturbing detail. He said that they went through the top of her head, stating, quote, "I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch." End quote. Dr. Watts then used an instrument that looked like a butter knife, swinging it up and down to cut Rosemary's brain tissue, while Dr. Freeman asked her some questions. It kind of reminds me of what they would do with the Siths in the fields when they were cutting wheat and stuff. That's basically, he just went in and started just stirring around in her brain with an instrument that was basically a butter knife. Dr. Watts said they estimated how much of the brain to cut based on how Rosemary responded. And when she became incoherent, they stopped. When she became incoherent, they stopped. Well, that's nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. The results of this were obviously devastating. Rosemary's mental capacity was diminished to that of a 2-year-old's. She became incontinent. She could no longer walk or speak. Afterwards, Rosemary was institutionalized and spent the rest of her life, over 6 long decades, in different care facilities. Initially a psychiatric hospital in New York, and from 1949 onward, the St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Wisconsin. That was the end of her sad story. That is where she lived. That is where she died. Alone, not knowing what the hell was going on. The icepick lobotomy, pioneered by Dr. Walter Freeman, was considered even more brutal and dangerous than the standard lobotomy. A traditional lobotomy involved kind of what Dr. James Watts described, or, drilling holes into the skull and severing connections in the prefrontal cortex with relative surgical precision, though still devastating. By contrast, the transorbital lobotomy skipped sterile operating rooms entirely. Freeman would insert a thin steel spike, like an ice pick, into the brain through the thin bone of the eye socket just above the eyeball. And then, with a few hammer taps, the pick penetrated into the brain, and then Freeman would sweep it side to side, severing neural pathways. Because that sounds like a good idea. That always sounds like a good idea. What do we need neural pathways for? What are those doing for us? On top of all of that, just the complete crude brutality of it all, no anesthesia was needed beyond local shock therapy to knock the patient out. This method took only 10 minutes and could be done in an office, a hospital ward, or even a patient's bedroom. It was surgery reduced to a roadside trick, fast, cheap, but indiscriminate. Because the procedure was blind and non-sterile, it caused massive collateral damage. The pick could go too deep, hitting areas that controlled speech, memory, or motor functions, and many patients were left unable to speak coherently with severe cognitive impairments or in a vegetative state. Others experienced personality flattening. They lost all initiative, emotional depth, all sense of self. Unlike a surgical lobotomy in a controlled setting, the transorbital lobotomy was a gamble. You might calm a patient's outbursts, but at the cost of destroying everything else that made them who they were. Freeman performed thousands of these procedures, often, mostly, without the involvement of trained surgeons. Because remember, he's not a surgeon. He's not a damn surgeon. He wasn't even a neurosurgeon. He was a neurologist. Not that I'm talking down about neurologists, but I don't think you would want a neurologist with no surgical training or expertise to perform an ice pick lobotomy through your eye. There was no oversight, no modern ethical review, and many times, once again, most times, no consent. Because it was so quick, asylums embraced it as a cheap way to control overcrowded populations, but it wasn't treatment. It was management through mutilation. So imagine the scene. I'm going to set it for you. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum already bursting at the seams with more than 2,000 patients crammed into a building meant for a fraction of that number. The hallways reek of disinfectant, sweat, and despair. Staff are exhausted, bitter, and overwhelmed. Patients wander half-starved, fighting amongst themselves or staring blankly into the distance or at a wall. And then one day, a strange van pulls up outside, carrying Dr. Walter Freeman, a man who calls himself a healer, a savior of the mentally ill. He isn't a surgeon, but he carries with him the tools of his trade, a hammer, a long steel pick, and the promise that in just minutes he can cure insanity. Freeman's arrival must have felt surreal. Patients were lined up in chairs, sometimes dozens in a day, while Freeman moved from one to the next, like he was working an assembly line. No operating theater, no surgical gowns, just a man with an ice pick and a hammer, sliding his instrument through the corner of an eye socket, striking it with precision and stirring the brain as casually as if he were mixing a cocktail, which he probably had a few of them before even doing any of this stuff. Staff watched in horror, or relief, depending on how desperate they had become for order in the chaos. Families, too, were promised miracles. A violent son would become docile. A depressed wife would smile again. But what came back from Freeman's cures were often broken shells of people, mute, incontinent, unable to recognize their own names, their own loved ones, their own children. Some died right there in the chair. Others were left to wander the overcrowded wards like ghosts in their own bodies. For Freeman, it was progress. For the patients of Trans-Allegheny, it was something closer to a nightmare, an era when medical authority and desperation collided and the human mind became nothing more than clay to be hacked apart in search of control. Thankfully, but not in time for Rosemary Kennedy, by the late 1950s, the tide was turning. Antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine were introduced, offering a far less invasive way to treat mental illness. At the same time, reports of the devastating long-term effects of lobotomies piled up. Patients left with flat personalities, impaired functioning, or completely dependent on care. Families who once praised Freeman began speaking out about ruined lives. In 1967, Dr. Freeman was finally banned from performing surgery after a patient he lobotomized for the third time died from a brain hemorrhage. At this point, the medical community had fully rejected his work, labeling it a dark and misguided chapter in psychiatry, and then closing that book. Disgraced, Freeman left medicine behind. He spent his later years driving around the United States in his van, visiting former patients in what he called follow-up tours. Some accounts say he believed many of them were still improved, though others were clearly left disabled or destroyed by his procedures. It kind of sounds like he wanted to do his follow-up tours because he wanted to prove to himself, like a confirmation bias, I did help people. I did, 10,000 icepick lobotomies, but 2 of these people were fine, right? He had to find the 2 people who hadn't been absolutely devastated by an ice pick to the eye. Freeman lived quietly in California and died in 1972 from complications of cancer surgery, never reinstated, never forgiven by the medical world or by the countless people that he harmed. By then, lobotomy was widely condemned as one of the most shameful medical procedures in modern history. Dr. Walter Freeman's dark deeds were eventually brought to a halt, but not before he had condemned thousands to lives forever and horribly changed. For the forgotten souls of Trans-Allegheny, his so-called cures were a death of the mind long before the body gave out. And it's said that their restless spirits still wander the asylum's endless corridors, bound to the place where their minds were stolen. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is privately owned and operated as a historic and paranormal attraction. They offer daytime history tours, overnight lockdowns, and ghost hunts, which I would love to do, by the way. I think I definitely will be looking into that within the next year or so. In 2020, a guest of one of these tours described their experience in the lobotomy ward. Quote, I suddenly couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I felt hands pushing me down. I had to leave the building. I've never been so afraid. End quote. And please understand what kind of torture Dr. Freeman put people through, and what kind of terrifying reality he sentenced them to live eternally in. I want you to really try and put yourself in the shoes of these people. The tragedy of a lobotomy was that the body survived while the conscious self often did not. Families described loved ones as shells. They were alive, but stripped of personality, drive, and identity. In that sense, a lobotomy was like forcing someone into a waking and walking coma. Sometimes they couldn't even walk, so a waking coma. Some of them could walk, eat, and speak, but the vibrant complexity of who they were was gone. In essence, the experience wasn't just physical mutilation, it was an erasure of personhood. That's why so many who underwent it, including Rosemary Kennedy, lived long lives in bodies that seemed physically present, of course, but minds that had been permanently silenced. It is honestly, to me, panic-inducing to imagine what kind of mental prison these people lived in after their lobotomy procedures. Many lobotomy patients showed signs that they were aware of their surroundings. They could track movement with their eyes, sometimes respond in simple ways, but their ability to form complex speech, complex thoughts, their ability to plan actions or express their inner thoughts was gone. This means they were likely experiencing things internally that they were unable to verbally express. Emotions are generated in deeper brain structures like the amygdala. So they don't disappear with a lobotomy, but the ability to regulate or express them does. Patients often became flat or childlike, not because they felt nothing, but because they had no pathway to process or share those feelings. Memory and sensation often remained intact. Patients could sometimes still recognize people, songs, or places, but the self that could reflect, question, or make meaning was fractured. Imagine remembering your family but being unable to say their names, or feeling sadness without the ability to cry or explain why. Unfortunately, even though they may have been admitted for short-term reasons, many patients would spend their entire lives at the asylum, and countless numbers died there. At Trans-Allegheny Insane Asylum, there were many ways to die, even if the lobotomobile didn't pull up. Tuberculosis ran like wildfire through the wards. Outbreaks of pneumonia, influenza, and measles occurred regularly, and several patients passed away from untreated infections, wounds, and pressure sores. Routine and easily treatable things like infected cuts and appendicitis went unnoticed or not cared about, leading to death, and nurses reported reusing syringes and not washing bedding for weeks. Some patients starved to death or died from dehydration in whatever dark and forgotten corner of the asylum they had been shoved into. Additionally, deaths from lethal restraint occurred at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum a lot. Originally, straitjackets were introduced in the 18th and 19th centuries as humane alternatives to chains or cages, but at asylums, they became a common tool to control violent, suicidal, or simply non-compliant patients, especially when the staff were overwhelmed, which was always, in those later years, always the staff were overwhelmed. While records are often vague, sometimes listed simply as heart failure or collapse, multiple asylum death reports across the country note patients dying while restrained. At Trans-Allegheny specifically, survivor accounts and oral histories reference patients being lost in seclusion rooms or restraints, with their deaths attributed to accidents, neglect, or sheer indifference. The straitjacket was supposed to be a safeguard, a way to keep the violent calm, the desperate from hurting themselves or others, but inside the stone walls of Trans-Allegheny, it became a slow, suffocating coffin. Imagine being forced into thick canvas, your arms bound so tightly across your chest that every breath feels like a battle. You are left alone in a barren room, the cold air pressing down, the faint sound of screams and laughter echoing through the halls. Hours slips into days. No one checks. No one remembers. The staff are exhausted, the asylum bursting with bodies stacked in every corner, and your life is just one more name on a ledger. Some struggled in their restraints until their hearts gave out. Others starved or wasted away from thirst, their cries muffled by the weight of the asylum's indifference. And when the silence finally came, their bodies were dragged to the fields outside, lowered into unmarked graves with no prayer, no marker, no memory. But the asylum remembers. Those forgotten souls, strapped down, silenced, suffocated by both canvas and neglect, they're said to linger still. Visitors report hearing the shuffle of restrained footsteps, the thud of unseen bodies against walls, and the hollow gasps of someone struggling for air. It is as if the asylum itself has taken on their torment, endlessly replaying the final moments of those who died in the grip of restraint. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying is that these people who were, usually just reacting to their horrible environments and trying to keep themselves safe or fight for food or space or privacy or protection. They were put in straitjackets, they were put in isolation rooms, and then they were left there. Were they left there intentionally? Were they just forgotten about? I would say a little bit of both. They were just left there to die, either from struggling and having a heart attack, suffocating, dehydration, starving. Imagine starving to death or dying from dehydration while you are so tightly restrained. It's very, very disturbing. So it's pretty common to hear about things like lobotomies and electroshock therapy. Both were performed indiscriminately at Trans-Allegheny, but lesser known treatment, equally damaging and sometimes deadly, was insulin coma therapy. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin until their bodies collapsed into seizures and coma, all in the name of treatment. The therapy was first developed in the late 1920s by an Australian neurologist named Manfred Sackel. Sackel had been working in Vienna as an assistant physician, treating morphine addicts and psychotic patients. Sometime in 1927 or 1928, while experimenting with small doses of insulin to calm withdrawal symptoms in morphine addicts, he accidentally gave one of his patients too much insulin, which, as you would expect, triggered a hypoglycemic coma. Luckily, this patient survived, and afterward, Manfred Sackel claimed he noticed that the patient's mental state had improved greatly, and this intrigued him. So Sackel began intentionally and systematically testing insulin-induced hypoglycemia on patients with schizophrenia, because it was his theory that the extreme metabolic shock somehow reset brain chemistry and metabolism. You see, Sacco believed that schizophrenia was a metabolic disorder of the brain, that the neurons were somehow poisoned or misfiring due to faulty cellular metabolism, and that a shock of some kind could reboot them, which, as we know, is absolutely ridiculous. You know how in the late 1990s we had Girls Gone Wild? Well, the century before that we had Doctors Gone Wild. These men were out here just throwing whatever they could at the wall to see what stuck. Insulin, comas, transorbital lobotomies, hydrotherapy, electroshock. They were legitimately operating in the dark, maybe both literally and figuratively. No real understanding of the brain, no long-term studies, just the blind leading the blind in white coats looking more like mad scientists than responsible medical professionals. And look, I get it. I get the argument that some people would make. This was part of the painful evolution of science and medicine. We had to go through these dark experimental phases to reach the understanding and the knowledge we have today. But it still does obviously break my heart as a human to think of all the patients, all the people who suffered, who were treated like human test subjects, enduring agony so that future generations could be spared it. And now we just endure different kind of agony at the hands of doctors and scientists. And those patients, those people in the past, they paid the price for that progress. Dr. Sacco's theory on schizophrenia had no obvious basis in neurobiology, and we now know that it's a complex neurodevelopmental disorder involving a lot of factors, from dopamine dysregulation to synaptic pruning abnormalities, even genetic predisposition. But it doesn't have anything to do with defective sugar metabolism. And hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar, doesn't reset neurons. You know what it does? It starves them. The brain depends almost entirely on glucose for energy. So when blood sugar crashes, neurons begin to die within minutes. When you drive someone intentionally into a hypoglycemic coma with insulin, the brain runs out of fuel and neurons stop firing normally. The body panics and releases adrenaline and cortisol to try to restore sugar, causing patients to shake, sweat, and have seizures. And if that coma lasts more than a few minutes, cells in the brain, specifically the hippocampus, cerebral cortex, and basal ganglia, they begin to die from energy deprivation, causing brain swelling, more seizures, even hemorrhage. If one were to survive this ordeal, there would be potential irreversible damage, such as memory loss, disorientation, and cognitive impairment. So the reset that Manfred Sacco described, it was really temporary suppression of higher brain function. And sure, patients would appear calm or compliant after a hypoglycemic coma, but not because they were cured, because they were neurologically exhausted or impaired. It's honestly so sickening to think about. Now, by 1933, Sacco was publicly reporting success rates of up to 70% recovery in schizophrenic patients, a number which created enormous hope and excitement at the time. But those numbers, we now know, were most certainly grossly exaggerated. That same year, Sacco published his first major paper in what he called Sacco's treatment, aka insulin shock therapy, while he was working at the Vienna University Psychiatric Clinic. His early results were presented as real-life miracles, touting high numbers of previously catatonic and psychotic patients who had been institutionalized for years, going home to their loved ones completely cured. Word of the treatment quickly spread to Germany, England, and the United States, and by the late 1930s, hundreds of psychiatric hospitals worldwide had established insulin wards to practice Sacco's treatment. Manfred Sacco himself became something of a celebrity in the field of psychiatry. He was praised in articles as a pioneer of biological psychiatry. But even in its heyday, insulin coma therapy still had serious critics. Some might call them the voice of reason, or the adults in the room. Mortality rates of this treatment ranged from 1% to 5%, sometimes higher, depending on the skill of the doctor and his staff. Some patients obviously suffered permanent brain damage or paralysis, and evidence of any real or lasting improvement was inconsistent and almost impossible to measure, honestly, because this evidence probably didn't exist. In 1953, psychiatrist Harold Bourne published a damning paper in The Lancet titled The Insulin Myth, claiming that he believed any supposed success stories from this therapy were due to luck or the placebo effect, selection bias, wishful thinking. Harold Bourne, bless his heart, absolutely tore Sackle apart in like a 1950s respectful way. And in 1950s psychiatry, that was a very bold move. People didn't call each other out like this in these professional circles. His paper wasn't just critical, it was surgical, dismantling the entire foundation of Sackle's therapy piece by piece, and it did so in a time when very few people dared to question the psychiatric establishment. At the time, insulin coma therapy had been around for nearly 2 decades, and it was popular. It was being widely practiced in hospitals all over the world. It had its own wards, specialized nurses, an entire institutional culture around it. So when Dr. Harold Bourne, a young psychiatrist at Maudsley Hospital in London, published The Insulin Myth, he was basically saying, the emperor has no clothes. And it never did. Now, did anyone listen to Dr. Bourne? At first, not really. Because like I said, there was some real money, time, and energy poured into this supposed miracle therapy. Nurses and doctors had training programs and prestige tied to it. Psychiatrists had based their entire careers on performing and teaching it. So even though Bourne's paper was very compelling and factual, most older psychiatrists ignored or downplayed it because of something we call ego. It would have been uncomfortable, after all, to acknowledge that Bourne was right, meaning these men had spent years harming patients under the illusion of a cure. However, Bourne's brave action planted a seed that could not be unplanted, and over the next few years, other researchers began to conduct actual controlled studies comparing insulin coma therapy to barbiturate-induced unconsciousness. So the natural question that science wanted to know was, is it the insulin that's helping, or is it just the act of being repeatedly put into a coma? And barbiturates were known for being able to induce deep sleep or reversible coma without lowering blood sugar, which made them the perfect control condition, meaning same coma, no insulin. By 1957, The Lancet published a landmark study proving there was no therapeutic difference between the two. And once antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine emerged around the same time, the dangerous insulin coma therapy lost its last desperate, egotistical defenders. By the early 1960s, the practice was largely ended in the West, and we do have Harold Bourne to thank for that in a large part. He didn't topple Sackle's empire overnight, but he did crack the foundation that made its collapse inevitable. Today, doctors do sometimes deliberately induce coma in their patients, but this is done for specific reasons, to protect the body or brain under extreme conditions, and it's done very carefully, very systematically, in the intensive care unit with round-the-clock monitoring using safer, more controllable drugs, not like rock-bottoming somebody's blood sugar. But these treatments, like insulin coma therapy, electroshock therapy, icepick lobotomies, and more, they actually happened, and people were actually subjected to them for a long time before the science caught up to ego. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands as both a monument to history and a reminder of how easily good intentions can decay into horror. The massive Gothic building has been preserved and reopened to the public as a museum and historic site, and like I said, visitors can take guided daytime tours, which focuses on the asylum's architecture, medical history, and patient life, or for those drawn to its darker legacy, overnight paranormal investigations that explore the wards said to still echo with the voices of the past. Even now, it is said, the air inside Trans-Allegheny feels heavy, as if it's holding its breath. The building has been empty for decades, yet it hums with a quiet pressure, a low vibration that seems to move through the stone itself. Paranormal investigators call it residual energy, others call it a haunting by restless spirits, but whatever name you give it, you can feel it. Every wall in that asylum absorbed something, the fear, the confusion, the helplessness, and it never quite released it. Limestone and sandstone are porous, they hold sound, moisture, memory, and we've talked about this before. It is well known that energy doesn't die. It doesn't go away, it transfers, it transforms. So if a century of agony unfolded inside those walls, where exactly did it go? No definitive records exist that tally exactly how many patients died inside the stone walls of Trans-Allegheny, but over its 130 years of operation, historians and local chroniclers estimate the total may run into the tens of thousands. Some figures used in the tours claim 30,000 deaths. What we do know is that some who passed away there, especially those without family, were buried in a private asylum cemetery on the hills above the grounds. The cemetery holds more than 2,000 memorials today, but almost none mark individual grave sites. In fact, no individual tombstones remain, just a single collective marker that stands in memory of those buried there. And that makes me mad, because how hard is it to make a marker of some kind for every person laid to rest in this cemetery? I don't mean now, because we don't have the records, but I mean then, when they were buried. The people who worked at that hospital, who cared for these patients, they knew their names, they had records, they had paperwork, and even if they didn't know their whole name, even if they didn't know their ages or their date of birth, they could have made some kind of human effort to give a story to the person they were burying in the ground. Even if this person went by a nickname, like Tiny Tim, here lies Tiny Tim. He really liked to play cards and he had a nice smile. Something. In accounts passed down over generations, they say that the bodies were often taken away quietly, unceremoniously, or sometimes in bulk. And all of this pain and neglect and lack of human decency has led to a very uncomfortable energy that lingers on those grounds. Visitors describe sudden temperature drops, the feeling of being watched, the overwhelming sense that the building itself is aware. Some hear whispers echoing through the patient wards, low and indistinct, like hundreds of conversations layered over each other. Others see flickers of movement in the corner of their eyes, a figure standing in a doorway, a face peering through shattered glass. On the upper floors, footsteps have been heard pacing above empty rooms, dragging slowly across the decaying floors, stopping when someone calls out. Many visitors to the now shut-down asylum speak of shadow figures, and these specific shadow figures were two past inmates that were connected to a very real murder that happened on one of the upper floors. Multiple accounts say that these two patients tried to hang another patient with bed sheets, and when that didn't work, they beat and tortured this man before ultimately placing his head underneath a bedpost and then jumping on the bed repeatedly and killing him. People say that the victim's spirit still lingers, and his killers take the form of two shadows who roam the asylum halls, including the room on the third floor where they carried out their dark deed. When these two shadow figures show up in the doorway of that room, the spirit of their victim will go quiet and still in fear. One tour guide who has worked at the asylum for decades has reported the most bone-chilling encounters. One night, this tour guide and a coworker were conducting a spirit box session in one of the asylum's countless rooms, hoping to make contact with whatever still lingered there. They're braver than I am. The spirit box device is essentially a modified radio designed to rapidly scan through AM or FM frequencies, so instead of locking onto a single station, the spirit box flicks through multiple channels per second, producing bursts of static, fragments of speech, music, or white noise, and paranormal investigators believe that spirits can manipulate those radio fragments to form words or phrases as a method of communicating with the living. I actually used a spirit box a few Harloweens ago in my Hinsdale House videos. If you haven't seen them yet, I will link them in the description box, but you should definitely check them out because I did hear things coming through the spirit box and I filmed it. For most of the evening, the guide and his coworker listened to the spirit box hiss and crackle with nothing but static until a single word broke through that white noise, and that word was evil. Now, before the guide could even react, his coworker grew pale and said she wanted to leave the room immediately. She claimed she had just heard the sound of footsteps shuffling outside the doorway, and moments earlier she had asked out loud if the spirit in the room with them was friendly, and the reply was as clear as day. One chilling word: evil. This spirit was not a nice or neutral ghost. That much was clear. On another night, while leading a tour through the same part of the building, the guide suddenly grew lightheaded and confused. This disorientation was followed by a burning sensation that he could feel crawling across his back, getting hotter by the minute. When he finally asked his coworker to look at his back, she lifted his shirt and found an angry red mark 4 inches long, like a scratch that had appeared out of nowhere, and that mark lingered for days. Even now, years later, he says that patch of skin still feels strange from time to time, tingling and hot, as if something left its fingerprint there and never really let go. But it's not just ghosts people talk about, it's the atmosphere. People describe Trans-Allegheny as a place that presses on you, as if the energy of thousands of tormented minds is still circling through those corridors, unable to find rest. Some say they believe the building feeds on emotion, that it listens when you speak, echoing your fear back to you. Paranormal teams have recorded disembodied voices, pleas for help, laughter that dissolves into sobbing. In one of the patient wings, the sound of rattling gurney wheels has been heard rolling toward the door, even when the hallway is empty. In another, the slam of iron doors reverberates in the dark long after the tour has moved on. There's a theory that when a place witnesses too much suffering, it becomes more than architecture. It becomes a kind of vessel. The walls remember. The floorboards remember. Even the air remembers. And at Trans-Allegheny, where thousands of minds broke and hundreds of bodies fell still, that memory feels present still. This is more than a haunting. It's a residue of human despair, crystallized in stone and shadow, replaying itself long after the world has moved on. And yet, Trans-Allegheny isn't the only place in Appalachia where pain refused to die. A few hundred miles west, on a lonely hill overlooking Louisville, Kentucky, another institution rose with the same promise of healing and the same descent into horror. It was built to save lives, but it became a factory of death, a place where the whisper of disease filled the air and the line between the living and the dead blurred like the fog that still rolls across its hillside. This is Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a place where compassion and contagion, faith and fear lived side by side. And like Trans-Allegheny, it's said that not everyone who entered ever truly left. Waverly Hills Sanatorium rises above Louisville like a monument carved from sorrow, a sprawling brick labyrinth perched on a wooded hill that once looked down over a dying city. When you see it from a distance, it almost looks peaceful, its long rows of windows catching the sun like open eyes. But up close, those windows become hollow and watchful, as if the building is remembering every life that passed through its doors. Waverly Hills was built to look like salvation. The architects chose Tudor Gothic, the same style used in old cathedrals and country manors, and the hope was that it would comfort patients, make them feel like they were entering a sanctuary instead of a hospital. The building stretched across the hillside in the shape of bat wings, 5 stories of brick, every corridor flooded with light and air. But the irony is almost poetic. Those same soaring arches and sunlit balconies became backdrops for thousands of deaths. The air that was meant to heal became heavy with infection, and the grand Gothic silhouette that once promised hope now looms like a warning, the benefit of foresight that the passage of time allows. Waverly Hills was a paradox from the very beginning, a building born of good intentions but conceived in fear. At the dawn of the 20th century, tuberculosis wasn't just a disease, it was a death sentence. We're all familiar with the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which turned the body of the afflicted dark with necrosis and bruising, and it killed fast. Tuberculosis was known as the White Plague because it literally drained the color and vitality out of its victims. Severe anemia robbed the skin of color. Weight loss and muscle wasting led to a fragile, ghostly appearance. Tuberculosis terrified people in a way that few modern diseases do today. It wasn't quick or quiet. It was slow, suffocating. It moved without mercy. It swept across the United States like a slow, invisible fire, claiming millions of lives. Entire families were wiped out, and cities like Louisville watched their populations dwindle while doctors stood helpless. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no understanding of how to truly stop it. And it didn't matter if you were rich or poor. If the bacteria found its way into your lungs, there really was no cure, only decline. The fear of death, of contagion, of the invisible enemy moving through the air drove the city to build Waverly Hills. They wanted the sick away from the healthy. That's the truth most people avoid saying out loud. The sanatorium was an act of compassion, yes, but it was also an act of containment, a way to put a wall between the dying and the living. And yet, within that fear, there was genuine hope. The doctors and nurses who came to Waverly weren't monsters. Many of them believed with everything they had that they were helping. They built solariums for sunlight, porches for fresh air, and gardens for peace. They wanted to heal. But the thing about fear is that once it takes root, it starts to shape everything, even good intentions. The result was a place that embodied both sides of the human condition: fear of death and the desperate desire to help and save lives. In 1924, construction began on the new state-of-the-art facility, which would become a massive 5-story, 400-bed brick sanatorium that still stands today, and it officially opened in October of 1926. The city poured enormous resources into the project, hiring skilled architects and builders to create a hospital that would combine science, comfort, and beauty. The Batwing floor plan allowed for maximum sunlight and airflow, which were key elements of what was known as the open-air cure. So before antibiotics, doctors had very few tools to fight tuberculosis, and treatment focused on one belief that dominated medicine for nearly half a century, and that belief was that fresh air heals. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, doctors thought that the bacteria that caused tuberculosis thrived in damp, stagnant urban air. The cure, they believed, was constant exposure to pure, moving air and sunlight. Now, the logic was simple and has something to it, but still flawed. If the disease attacked the lungs, then clean air would cleanse the lungs. That was the logic, right? If patients were weak, then sunlight would strengthen them. At tuberculosis hospitals across the world, and especially in places like Waverly Hills, everything revolved around that one idea. Patients spent nearly every hour outside, lying in beds or reclining chairs, even through the winter. The sanatorium's long wings and balconies were built specifically to let wind sweep through the wards. Even during snowstorms, the windows remained open so patients could breathe the curative air. Nurses would wrap them in heavy blankets, sometimes covering their faces in layers of gauze as frost formed on their eyelashes. And obviously, ultraviolet rays were believed to kill the bacteria, so patients were positioned to face the sun for hours, sometimes until their skin blistered. Now, the wards themselves were silent, but always alive with coughing. At Waverly, rows of patients lay in beds along the veranda, breathing in the chill wind, watching the fog drift through the trees below. For many, the view of that forest was the last thing they ever saw. Now, to be fair, the open-air cure wasn't entirely baseless. Fresh air does have a higher concentration of oxygen compared to the recirculated indoor air we usually breathe, and more oxygen means a lot of things. It means better circulation, improved energy, even improved brain function. Fun fact, did you know that the brain uses about 20% of the body's oxygen supply? And that's because neurons don't store oxygen or glucose the way that muscles do. They need a constant, uninterrupted supply delivered through the bloodstream. And without enough oxygen, the brain neurons can't fire properly, and even small dips in oxygen levels can cause mental fog, dizziness, poor concentration, or fatigue. And that's one reason why people say they feel better or think more clearly after they, get some fresh air, go for a walk outside. And while it doesn't kill bacteria the way old tuberculosis doctors hoped, fresh air does support the immune system in subtle but powerful ways, because we know indoor air can carry higher concentrations of dust, mold, and other irritants that inflame the respiratory system, so fresh air flushes the lungs and reduces inflammation. And being outdoors exposes you to sunlight, which triggers vitamin D production, which is important for immune function and mood regulation. On that note, we also know that being outside, breathing in fresh air, and absorbing sunlight has intense mental and emotional benefits, from reducing stress hormones to regulating the nervous system. Research shows that even just 10 to 20 minutes a day outdoors can significantly lower anxiety, improve mood, and enhance concentrations. Psychologists call it biophilia, the innate human tendency to seek connection with the natural world because it soothes the mind on an ancient and instinctual level. So, as I said, the open air cure wasn't necessarily harmful, but it was certainly no cure. And they didn't need to be putting these sick patients out in like the winter while icicles were growing on their faces. They didn't need to be outside for that long. That was probably doing more harm than good. So, with the open air cure being basically all that the tuberculosis doctors could do, most patients continued to decline, wasting away slowly over months or years. The bacteria kept eating through their lungs, no matter how much sunlight or fresh air they breathed in. What made it tragic was that the patients believed in it. Families would visit and see their loved ones bundled under blankets in the freezing cold, and they would take comfort in thinking it was part of their recovery. In reality, the cure was mostly prolonged dying disguised as true hope, and this is where things take a dark turn. Because after the open air cure failed to stop tuberculosis, medicine turned desperate. And this desperation led to something called collapse therapy, a brutal chapter in medical history where doctors literally crushed, deflated, or removed parts of patients' lungs. They removed parts of patients' ribs in a very misguided attempt to help them. This is the moment where hope tipped into full horror. By the late 1920s, doctors knew that sunlight and fresh air weren't curing tuberculosis. The disease was relentless, eating away at lung tissue, filling airways with fluid, and spreading like wildfire through coughing. In fact, working in a tuberculosis hospital was one of the most dangerous jobs at this time. And that was during a time when there was like miners and, factory workers and stuff like that. There was a lot of dangerous jobs at this time, but working in a TB ward was among the most dangerous. And that's because the bacterium responsible for the disease, it spread very easily through airborne droplets, meaning that a single cough in a closed ward could infect anyone nearby. Medical staff were exposed constantly, often for years, without proper ventilation or protection. A 1939 study estimated that TB incidence among nurses was 4 to 5 times higher than the general population, and of those who became infected, nearly half eventually died from it. Many of the doctors and nurses who worked at Waverly Hills and similar institutions viewed their job, their work, as a calling. Tuberculosis was called the White Plague, and those who treated it were often described in newspapers as angels of mercy. They lived on site, they ate in communal dining halls, and they often cared for patients who were coughing blood into their hands. Some nurses caught TB after just months on the job. Others stayed for years, knowing that every shift might be their last. Personal letters and oral histories from sanatorium workers paint a heartbreaking picture. Nurses writing to families, saying things like, "I feel a little tired tonight. Perhaps the work has finally caught up with me," only to die a few months later from the same illness they were treating. So there was a real desire to figure out a cure, because those working directly with these patients were constantly at a very high risk for coming down with and dying from that same disease. But because there was no antibiotics yet, physicians came to believe that the only way to heal the lungs was to make them stop moving. The theory was that if a diseased lung could be forced to collapse, it would rest, giving infected cavities time to heal and scar over. And that idea gave birth to a series of experimental procedures that sound almost medieval today. Artificial pneumothorax was the first and least invasive form of collapse therapy, developed around 1890 and used heavily by the 1920s. Doctors inserted a large needle between the patient's ribs and pumped nitrogen gas into the space between the lung and chest wall. The trapped gas would then compress the lung, forcing it to deflate, in theory, allowing the infected areas to close and scar, cutting off oxygen to the tuberculosis bacteria. Patients often described the feeling of being crushed from the inside, because they were. They would be gasping, but not able to draw a full breath in. which sounds absolutely horrifying to me. If you've ever had a panic attack and you feel like you can't take a full breath cycle, you know that that's very, anxiety inducing. So to imagine your lung being intentionally collapsed and how that would feel and how it always would feel that way, I'm starting to feel it a little bit right now. So when a single lung collapse wasn't enough, doctors turned to surgery. And thoracoplasty was the most extreme form of treatment and one of the most infamous procedures performed at Waverly Hills. In this procedure, doctors would surgically remove parts of the rib cage, sometimes 6, 8, or even a dozen ribs. They did this so that the chest wall would cave in and permanently compress the lung underneath. This was not a good way of handling things, to say the least. Patients were kept under anesthesia for hours while their ribs were sawed away, and their recovering was understandably agonizing and even disfiguring. Many patients ended up with severe deformities, their chests sunken inward, their spines twisted, because once the ribs were gone, the chest lost its support and soft tissue sagged inward like fabric without a frame. You'd think that a doctor would know that. And because one side of the rib cage was shorter and weaker, the spine naturally curved towards it, trying to compensate. And the patient's shoulder would drop, and they'd have restricted movement in that arm. With half the chest rigid or concave, breathing became shallow and asymmetric, with the remaining lung overexpanding to once again compensate, and this distorted the ribcage even further. In extreme cases, the heart was displaced slightly towards the collapsed side, altering circulation and contributing to fatigue and shortness of breath. For people who did survive this, and for people who did survive tuberculosis, because keep in mind, tuberculosis was a death sentence, and there was no cure for it. But some people did survive, just like some people survived the bubonic plague. It just depended on a lot of different factors. For people who did live, breathing was always labored, even years later. Many could not raise their arms above their heads after their surgery, and others lived with chronic pain from scar tissue and nerve damage. And I want to address this because I said tuberculosis was a death sentence. And yes, that is how it was viewed because so many people who caught it died from it, and so many people were catching it. It wasn't like a 50-50 thing. A lot of people were getting sick with tuberculosis, but some people did survive the tuberculosis infection. So when you have things like this, a lung collapsing sort of technique, and then those people would survive, the doctors would be like, see, collapsing your lung worked. But no, it didn't. This procedure did not cure tuberculosis. It actually just allowed more time for the infection to spread to the other lung. And some people did survive tuberculosis and even this lung collapse thing. And just like the bubonic plague, not everybody who got it ended up dying from it. Not everyone who got tuberculosis ended up dying from tuberculosis. Some people survived, and then the doctors and the scientists would be like, oh, it's because of what we did to you, but it wasn't. And I actually looked it up. There are historical and scientific evidences of why some people either didn't catch TB or did catch TB and didn't die from it. And it's very interesting, so I'm going to read it to you. This says that survivors of TB often had a strong innate immune response. They had very effective macrophages, which are the blood cells, the white blood cells that eat bacteria. So because TB was caused by a bacterium, these strong white blood cells got to work real quick eating that bacteria. There's also a genetic component where specific genes can influence TB outcomes. For instance, there's VDR gene variants, or the vitamin D receptor, because vitamin D is critical for activating those macrophages against TB, and people whose bodies were more responsive to vitamin D likely fought off infection more effectively, which actually leads me to believe now that putting them in the sun may have actually helped them, at least those people with that gene variant. Although to the point of sunburn and having blisters form on your skin, that probably wasn't healthy. There's another gene called NRAMP1, which helps macrophages limit bacterial growth by controlling iron availability. And then these two other genes, HLA-DRB1 and TLR2/TLR4, those also appear more frequently in populations or families that historically showed higher TB survival. Interestingly, this might explain why some individuals exposed to tuberculosis never developed active disease. Their immune systems contained it early, forming latent TB instead of fatal pulmonary TB. And that's super interesting. And so that makes sense why some of these doctors and nurses who were working at Waverly Hills for years and always thinking like, oh, I could die today, I could catch TB today, and then die like my patients, they never did. They were able to stay there for years. There were other experimental methods performed as well, like a phrenic nerve crash, which was a severing or disabling of the nerve that controls the diaphragm with the intent to paralyze one side of the chest. There was also something called plomage, which was the surgical insertion of materials like paraffin wax, oil, even ping pong balls. They would insert these materials into the chest cavity to collapse the lung. I'm not even kidding. I know this sounds like something I just made up, but it really happened. In some hospitals, they even inserted lucite spheres that were used for doll's eyes, which adds another creepy layer to this whole thing, as if it needed it. And this wasn't just a temporary thing. They weren't like, let's put some, ping pong balls in your lungs, and then when you get better, we will remove them. No. After the surgery, the incision was closed, and these objects, whether ping pong balls or wax or doll's eyes, they were left permanently inside the body. By the 1930s and 40s, Waverly Hills was no longer a hospital in the hopeful sense. It had become a place of endurance and experimentation. Patients arrived knowing there was a good chance they'd never leave, and the air was always thick with antiseptic and dread. Surgery days at Waverly Hill were described as the worst days of the week. There was no real anesthesia as we know it today. Ether and morphine were used, but patients often woke up mid-procedure, coughing or gasping as their lungs were being collapsed. A 1938 nursing journal from a sanatorium in Rutland, Massachusetts recorded, quote, "The cries could be heard from one ward to the next. We learned to hum or pray to drown it out," end quote. Another nurse, Margaret Foster, who worked in a Michigan TB hospital in the early 1940s, said, quote, "The air was heavy with disinfectant, but you could still smell blood. It was always cold. There was a sense that we were fighting something invisible, and it was winning," end quote. A doctor who worked at Saranac Lake Hospital recalled, quote, "The patients were brave. They rarely complained. But the fear in their eyes before thoracoplasty was something I will never forget. They knew they might not wake up," end quote. Patients often lived at the sanatorium for years. Some arrived as teenagers and left as adults if they got better. Some arrived as children or young people and they never left at all. The wards were long and quiet except for coughing fits that never really stopped. Helen Adams, who spent 5 years in a Colorado sanatorium, described it this way, quote, "You learned the rhythm of the dying. The nurse would come, pull the screen around a bed, and you'd hear the shuffling as they carried someone out. Then the screen would open again, and life went on," end quote. Anna McLean, who underwent a thoracoplasty in 1942, said, quote, "After the surgery, I felt like I'd been folded in half. My shoulder dropped, my ribs were gone, and I couldn't take a deep breath, but I was alive, and they said that meant I was lucky," end quote. She would have been alive regardless of whether or not they did that procedure. She would have still lived. If she was meant to survive TB because of whatever was going on with her genes or her immune system, she would have been fine. The surgery was completely unnecessary. Now, some patients still did try to remain hopeful. "We called it taking the cure," one woman said in a 1950 oral history, "but no one ever really got better. We just waited for someone else to go." Nurses were the heart of these hospitals, but also their emotional casualties. As I said, The nurses lived on the grounds, often in dormitories just above the wards, and many caught the disease themselves. One former Waverly Hills nurse interviewed in the 1970s remembered, quote, "We used to pray before every shift, not for ourselves, but for them. You could hear the screams from the surgical floor and the coughing from the death ward. Sometimes you couldn't tell which was worse," end quote. Another nurse wrote in a letter to her sister, quote, "The tunnel terrifies me. I know it's meant to spare the patients from seeing the dead, but I can't forget that every time I walk through it. I'm passing souls we couldn't save," end quote. So you might be wondering what tunnel this nurse was talking about, and I'm going to tell you. When Waverly Hills was constructed in 1924, it sat high on a hill overlooking Louisville, and that isolation was intentional. Doctors believed the elevation and constant breeze would keep the air clean and prevent the spread of disease, and it was far away from the city, but it did create a logistical problem: how to get supplies up and bodies down. So during construction, engineers designed a 500-foot-long concrete tunnel sloping downward from the main hospital to the base of the hill. It had two sections, a stairway for staff running along one wall and a motorized rail system on the other side used for transporting laundry, food, and later dead bodies. The incline was steep, about 45 degrees, and the tunnel was lined with cold, damp concrete. It stayed cool year-round, which helped preserve the dead until they could be taken away. In the early years of Waverly Hills, the tunnel did simply act as a service corridor, but as tuberculosis deaths increased, sometimes climbing to a dozen or more a day, it took on a new and grim purpose. Doctors realized that patients were losing hope when they saw the dead being carried out through the front entrance, so the staff made a decision. The dead would leave through the tunnel. Like many things at Waverly Hills, this decision was meant as an act of kindness and with good intentions, but it gave the building an eerie rhythm. Gurneys or stretchers would be placed on the motorized rail and slowly lowered to waiting hearses at the bottom. This took several minutes, and throughout the trip, the tunnel would echo with the rattle of metal wheels. Staff members who later spoke about the body tunnel described it as one of the hardest parts of their job, with one former orderly recalling, quote, "It was quiet, except for the hum of the pulley. You didn't talk. You didn't breathe much. It felt like you were lowering them into the earth," end quote. Another nurse, quoted decades later, said, quote, "We all hated the tunnel. You could feel the cold coming up from it even when the doors were closed," end quote. In a letter written when she was working at the sanatorium, the same nurse said, quote, "The tunnel terrifies me," end quote. Today, the tunnel, or the body chute, is one of Waverly's most infamous features and a centerpiece of nearly every paranormal tour. I think we can understand why. Visitors describe the air as unnaturally cold, even in the summer, and the sound of faint footsteps or rolling wheels echoing up from the darkness. Some report the sensation of feeling watched or followed, and others say they can hear whispers and crying. Ghost hunters often capture EVPs in the tunnel that sound like moans, coughing, or faint voices calling names. Guides say that even skeptics tend to fall silent down there, not necessarily because of the ghosts, but because of what it represents. It's the physical embodiment of loss and a place where tens of thousands made their final journey, one by one, into the dark. If the body chute beneath Waverly Hills was where the dead left, the 5th floor was where the dying waited to leave. This was the isolation ward, where the most contagious patients were kept away from everyone else. The 5th floor was different from the rest of the hospital. It wasn't like the other wards, lined with long rows of beds. It was smaller and more contained, and it had access to an outdoor terrace where patients could be wheeled into the sun. That sunlight did not make anyone feel less cursed. In fact, people said the air was heavier there, as if the building itself knew it was the last stop before the body chute. The most enduring story from the 5th floor of Waverly Hills Sanatorium is about room 502, a room that to this day even seasoned tour guides hesitate to enter alone. The story goes that in 1928, a young nurse working at Waverly Hills was found hanging from a light fixture in room 502. This woman's name has been lost to time. Some say she was called Mary Lee, others say her name was Margaret, but according to hospital records, a nurse did in fact die by suicide that year. Like her name, the reason why she committed this act is unknown. Some say she was pregnant and unwed, which would have been scandalous at the time. Others say she became infected with tuberculosis herself and couldn't bear the thought of dying the way her patients did, coughing, gasping for air, fading away slowly and tortuously. Whatever the truth, her death severely shook the staff of the hospital. Room 502 was closed for a period of time, and after that, nurses began reporting strange things. Lights turning on by themselves, the sounds of footsteps pacing overhead, a lingering feeling of being observed by unseen eyes. A few years later, the story deepened. Another nurse was found dead in the same area, this time after jumping from the 5th-floor balcony. Some believe that she was pushed, others claim that she was driven mad by the endless death and hopelessness around her. The details blurred with time, but even today, the 5th floor is known for its uneasy silence, and paranormal investigators have captured voices pleading for help, the flicker of shadows along the walls, and the sounds of people faintly sobbing when no one is there. One tour guide said, quote, "When you stand in room 502, you can feel it. Not fear exactly, but sorrow, like the air remembers," end quote. Visitors have often described a tall female figure standing in the doorway of room 502. Sometimes she is solid and seen wearing a nurse's uniform. Sometimes she's just a shape or a shadow. But when she is seen, people feel sudden nausea, dizziness, or an overwhelming sense of despair. Others report the sound of distant laughter or footsteps circling them in the empty hall outside the room. Some see shapes moving through the solarium, which is what they call the outside terrace, and they say these shapes are human silhouettes, but they seem to watch from afar. They never approach. Skeptics say it's suggestion, imagination, or just the effects of bad lighting, but many who have actually been there insist it's something else entirely. And they say the 5th floor carries the imprint of everyone who broke under the weight of that place, nurses and patients alike. But not all of Waverly's spirits are dark, and some reportedly belong to children who lived and died there. During the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, entire families were brought to the hospital, and when parents were infected, their children were often quarantined in separate wards. Some of the children became infected as well and never made it out. The most well-known is Timmy, a little boy said to haunt the 3rd floor. Visitors come and they leave Timmy toys, especially balls, and many have claimed to see these little presents move on their own. Sometimes the ball will roll gently across the floor or bounce softly against a wall when no one is near it. Paranormal investigators have caught faint laughter, the sound of a child humming, or a ball appearing to lift slightly and drop again. The non-believers laugh and say that a child ghost is not moving these balls, that anything odd is due to drafts or uneven floors. But those who have been there say it feels different. It feels playful and innocent, like Timmy's still waiting for someone to play with him. Then we have the children's ward itself, once lined with bright murals, little beds and windows that looked out over the valley. Nurses would bring in toys and books for the kids, and sometimes Santa Claus would even pay a visit at Christmas time. They even had a rooftop playground with swings and a slide where the children could play and get fresh air and sun. Today, visitors also bring and leave gifts there. Little teddy bears, baby dolls, freshly painted toy cars. And guides say that when you walk through the hallway, you can hear faint giggles or the patter of small footsteps. Sometimes the toys move, and many have reported the air smelling faintly of baby powder. One investigator claimed to hear the voice of a little girl on a spirit box saying, "I miss my mommy," and others have recorded what sounds like children singing. For the children of Waverly Hills, life was a strange kind of half-childhood. Their days were filled with medicine cups, whispered prayers, and the sound of coughing echoing down long white corridors. Nurses became their mothers. The other patients became their family. They were taught to smile when the sun reached their beds, believing that the fresh air could make them well. But as the disease worsened, many knew the truth before anyone said it out loud. They were alone, separated from their parents, who were often sick themselves or already gone. And the nights for the children were the hardest, when the wards grew quiet, the lights dimmed, and the wind from the solarium carried in the smell of rain and pine. Some of these children must have lain awake, wondering if their parents were still alive, wondering if anyone would remember them when they were gone. And the nurses did what they could to soften the edges of dying. They brought toys to the bedside, read stories in quiet voices, and hummed lullabies when the coughing wouldn't stop. Some smuggled in small gifts, a candy, a brightly colored hair ribbon, anything that reminded the children of their lives before, of a world outside that still existed. When a child grew too weak to move, the nurses would open the windows wider so the wind could touch their faces, and they would tell the children it was their parents' love coming to carry them home. They couldn't save them, but they could make sure they didn't die afraid and alone. Many of those nurses later said that they still remembered the sound of the children's laughter, that it never really left the halls. Maybe that's why so many say they can still hear it now, soft and fleeting, like an echo of the kindness that refused to die here. They say that Waverly has seen so much death that even the shadows learned how to live. And we've talked more than once in this video about how people see shadow figures there at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Throughout the entire building, they see them, from the morgue to the solariums. Countless visitors report shadow people, shadow figures, human-shaped silhouettes that dart across hallways or peek out from doorways. And keep in mind, these aren't misty or transparent apparitions. They're solid, blacker than the night itself. Investigators say they're the most active on the 3rd floor, where the corridors stretch endlessly into black. Some see them standing perfectly still at the end of the hall. Others feel them following just a few steps behind. Flashlights flicker, cold spots appear and vanish. People have reported feeling fingers brush their hands or necks. One visitor said a shadowy figure lurched towards her, and then she felt hands around her neck choking her. And 8 years ago, a Reddit user posted that he'd worked as a volunteer at Waverly Hills and had been present for many tours and investigations. I mean, he worked as a volunteer after it closed and it was open for tours. He wasn't there during the TB days. But he said, quote, "I will start by saying this. Doesn't matter who you are or what your beliefs are, things happen in that building that are not explainable. I've seen people get possessed, and I have had something attempt to take control of me as well. I have heard voices with nobody around. I have smelled cigars when nobody was smoking. I have been pushed up against a wall, seen a doppelganger, and watched inanimate objects move on their own." End quote. In his post, he goes on to explain that one night he was part of an overnight investigation that featured 2 small groups of people, and his significant other, along with her cousin and her cousin's wife, were there as well on the 4th floor, along with a couple other people from one of the groups. So the Reddit poster said he left for a short amount of time because he had to use the bathroom, and he had to go downstairs to do that. And when he returned to the 4th floor, he could not find the group, which included the people he knew, his, significant other and her family members. And this Reddit poster said, quote, "I ended up finding all of them on the 2nd floor shaking. After I had walked downstairs, they all saw the exact same thing at the same time. They all saw a very large black shadow come crawling on the floor rapidly. My significant other, who doesn't believe, was in tears. None of the people in the group would go back to the 4th floor. It really is something to take a total skeptic and let them see something so unexplainable for themselves." End quote. So this Reddit poster had explained earlier how his significant other doesn't believe in the supernatural, doesn't believe in any of that stuff, is very, logical, thought that they were going to go to Waverly Hills and laugh and kind of make fun of the whole thing, and that is not what ended up happening. The poster continues on in the comments saying that the shadow figure was humanoid but moving faster than any human could in that position, and he said he has seen that same figure on the walls before, moving like a spider. Now, legend has it, this shadow figure is very real, and they call it the creeper. It moves low along the walls or across the ceiling, sometimes skittering up towards the rafter before vanishing into the dark. Witnesses say it doesn't walk like a person. It almost seems to cling, dragging itself on all fours, long-limbed and not human. Some describe it as a shadow with depth, like it absorbs the light around it. People who see the creeper often feel it before they spot it, and this feeling comes in the form of a sudden pressure on the chest, dizziness, or the sense that the air has thickened. A few people have even passed out, claiming it felt like all the oxygen was being pulled out of the room. No one knows what it is, but some say the creeper isn't a single ghost at all. It's a combination of ghosts. And when I read that, I sat with that thought for a while, and I contemplated about what that might mean and why something like that may have happened, like a culmination of spirits coming into one. And I had a theory, because I'm a very big believer of energy being tangible and being able to be felt and even seen and processed by some people. So maybe the creeper is something born from a combination of elements, from every ounce of grief, fear, and pain that's soaked into those walls. Imagine thousands of souls dying here, alone and slowly and terrified, and their final thoughts echoing in the dark. Maybe that energy didn't fade. Maybe it gathered, drawn together like atoms seeking a form. And what emerged wasn't human or a spirit or even a ghost. It was the physical manifestation of a collective energy supply. The darkness that connected them in life became one being in death, a consciousness built from despair, from the powerlessness they all felt as they wasted away. Perhaps the creeper isn't here to harm. Maybe it's trying to leave, to claw its way out of Waverly Hills, out of the grief that created it. Maybe this crawling shadow is the souls of the forgotten, still searching for a way to rise up and leave the place that trapped them in life and in death. We can look at this through the lens of science, which tells us that energy cannot be destroyed. It only changes form. In a place like Waverly Hills, that energy wasn't peaceful. It was steeped in fear, pain, loss, hopelessness, and anger. Tuberculosis was called consumption for a reason, because it consumed you, not suddenly, but slowly, deliberately, over months and sometimes years. It started quietly, a lingering cough, a fever that came and went, a tiredness that sleep couldn't fix, but as the infection took hold, it began to hollow you out from the inside. The lungs filled with tiny lesions that made each breath feel like inhaling through sandpaper. The coughing became violent, racking you until it felt like your ribs might crack. You coughed up thick, dark phlegm streaked with blood, sometimes so much that the taste of iron never left your mouth. Fever burned you constantly, making the skin ache to the touch, while night sweats drenched the bed sheets until the chill set in again, shaking the body with exhaustion. Eating became nearly impossible. The body wasted away as the infection consumed the nutrients faster than you could take them in. Your face grew gaunt, cheekbones sharp under translucent skin. For many, the voice grew faint, raspy from weeks of coughing, until even whispering was a painful struggle. The pain wasn't just in the lungs, though. TB could spread to the spine, the brain, the kidneys. Some patients lost the ability to stand. Others slipped into delirium, hallucinating from fever and oxygen deprivation. And through it all, there was a terrible awareness. Tuberculosis was so slow. And so you had time to understand what was happening to you, to feel yourself fading, the air growing harder to grasp. Every breath was work, the coughs coming in waves until there was nothing left but the rattling sound of air moving through blood and fluid. It is said that in the final days, patients would often feel a strange calm. The body was too tired to fight anymore. The fever burned itself out. The coughing stopped, and the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was surrender. The lungs filled completely, suffocating the last breath from within. To die of tuberculosis was to drown slowly in your own body, not in water, but in blood and fluid and disease. Every breath drawn in agony, every scream swallowed up by the walls of Waverly Hills. And I think it left a trace. Some researchers believe this kind of trauma can create what's known as residual energy, electromagnetic disturbances that repeat like echoes long after the source is gone. But what if, in rare cases, that energy doesn't just replay? What if it evolves? Imagine thousands of those imprints merging over time, all that psychic weight drawn together like charged particles, binding into a single consciousness made of shared suffering. That could be what the creeper really is, not a monster, not a demonic spirit, but the combined energy of souls who died powerless, trying to reclaim control, to pull themselves together into something strong enough to finally escape. In Appalachia, the woods are not the only things that watch, and the mountains don't sleep there. They listen. We built our own wilderness out of stone, Trans-Allegheny to hold the screaming quiet. Waverly Hills to stack the breaths of the dying in neat brick corridors. In Weston, the night still carries the drag of canvas, the scrape of a metal bed you can't quite place, and the click of a latch that never opens in time. If you stand still long enough, something behind you knows your name and tests it on the air. It isn't kind, it isn't cruel, it's just there. In Louisville, the hill holds its breath. The body chute exhales a cold that doesn't belong to weather. Room 502 waits with a patience only the dead can manage. Down the halls, a ball rolls without a foot to guide it. Up above, something crawls where gravity should win. The lights don't flicker, they hesitate, like they're deciding whether to show you what's standing in the doorway. People ask why the shadows stay. Maybe they don't. Maybe the shadows are growing, stitched from every lost breath, every swallowed scream, every "this won't hurt" that did hurt. Maybe the creeper isn't a ghost at all, but the shape sorrow takes when it realizes it can walk. Appalachia keeps what it's given. Coal, blood, hymns, names, silence. We gave it fear wrapped as mercy, cures that felt like punishments, and rooms that forgot the difference between prayer and apology. Now, the hills hold the receipt. If you leave tonight and something paces you in the tree line, don't run. That's only the country making sure you heard it. And if you feel a breath on the back of your neck, cold, damp, and patient, don't turn around. You already know what's there. This has been Tales from Appalachia, where even if the woods let you pass, these man-made buildings may not. I thank you for being here, and I have one thing to tell you before we leave today's video. Because of how much everybody loved Tales from Appalachia Part 1, and hopefully how much everyone loves this Part 2, and the comments saying, we love when you do creepy historical stuff, and we love when you talk about historical stories and the way you do it. Because of that, I want to let you know, because some of you are new here. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for being here and welcome. But some of you are new here, and some of you have been with me since day one, and you know I love you for it. But I want to tell everyone, both old and new, that I have many of these types of videos. In fact, I used to do a series called Dark History years ago, before someone else stole that name and started using it and acted as if I wasn't already doing that and using that name for quite a while before they did that. So I did have a Dark History series where we talked about things just like this, and I will link that playlist in the description box. I'm also going to link the Hinsdale House series that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the spirit box. And I'm going to link several other Harloween videos that I think you guys would like if you like this sort of thing, because I've done a bunch of them. And like I said, some of you are new and you haven't been here for Halloween. Some of you maybe haven't seen every Halloween video, but I'm going to link a bunch of things in the description box so that while you're waiting for our next Halloween video to come, you'll have things to watch if you haven't seen them already. On that note, I want to also tell you, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being here with me, for commenting, for having the same kind of passion and enjoyment in these things that I do. It makes me feel very connected to you, and it makes me feel very happy to continue delivering these stories to you. I cannot wait to hear from you in the comment section about what you thought of this video. And I would also ask you to like the video if you liked it, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and subscribe if you haven't already. Become a part of our growing family. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you very, very soon. And until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and stay spooky. And I'll see you very soon.